Hello, and welcome to the Just and Sinner podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper, and thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. Now, I just want to give you all a quick reminder that Just and Sinner as an organization and everything that we do is supported by donors. So we would ask that you consider becoming a regular contributor. Something you can do to help is to go to our website, go to our donate page, it's justandsinner.org. And if you go to the donate page there, we have information about why you should donate, how you can support us. And we have a brochure that you can print out, give to people, say in your church, your pastor, someone that you think may be interested in supporting the work of an organization like ours. Even if they are not the people that are watching the videos or listening to the podcast, there are reasons to support us because we are helping local congregations to grow and to gain members. And we are sending people regularly to local Lutheran congregations. And one other thing I want to mention, we have an email list. You can go to justandsinner.org on the right side of the page, at least if you're on a desktop. If you're on an app, you got to kind of scroll down to the bottom of the page. But there is a form you can fill out to join our contact list. We are currently giving away a free PDF of Christoph Ernst Luthart's book, The Saving Truths of Christianity. And Luthart was a student in Berlin at the same time that Stahl was a professor there. So it's a great book. Highly recommend reading it, and it's free if you sign up now. It's not going to be we don't have an explicit date yet that we're taking it down, but this is a limited time offer. So if you want to take advantage of that, please do. And you'll get regular updates from us and offers and all sorts of stuff. Okay, we are discussing Friedrich Julius Stahl. And so we are going to be going into now some of his political thoughts. On the first part of this, we discussed Stahl's background. We looked at what's going on in Prussia, what's going on with Enlightenment liberalism and some of the challenges that they were facing, the divides in the German academy at this time, the kind of rising modernity versus Lutheran orthodoxy and that whole setting. Now we are going to have an opportunity to delve into the particulars of Stahl's philosophy. That's really where we want to go. If you haven't watched the first part, it really is helpful to get some context of why Stahl is saying the things that he is. But if you just want to watch this part, that's okay. So, all right. So the first thing I want to say is Stahl's work is largely a critique of rationalist liberalism. And liberalism itself is it's a broadly defined term. So I know that I've gotten some critique, and there are a couple people that have pushed back at me when I have critiqued liberalism because they've said that I'm not being fair in my definition of liberalism. And I will say that in the literature you read on political thought, liberalism is used in a variety of ways. So someone like an Edmund Burke can sometimes be said to be a liberal and a conservative liberal. There are other interpretations and other ways of using the term, I think, liberal, that would set liberal and conservative as opposites. Not that there aren't any right liberals or classical liberals, as they may be called. But what I don't want to do is get into a debate of how you're defining the term liberalism. So I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to say here is what he is criticizing is what we may call a rationalist liberalism. Okay, so Stahl makes the argument that, okay, well, maybe I'll take a step back. What do I mean by rationalist liberalism? That will probably be necessary before I jump into this. So a rationalist liberalism, there are a number of figures that we're thinking about here that are influential on the development of liberalism. And there are other figures that might not be considered liberal, but contribute significantly to elements of the liberal system. Rousseau with his book on social contract, but he's not quite liberal in the way that a John Locke is. But essentially, if you're going to boil down the liberal system, when you look at figures like a John Locke or some of Kant's ideas, or I mentioned Thomas Paine before. You've got Rousseau, who's influential there. John Stuart Mill is very influential. Bentham is very influential in the development of liberalism. Okay, all sorts of figures. I don't need to name who all of them are. But there are some basic assumptions that lay underneath their writing. Now the first of these is that rational thought is capable of arriving at a clear understanding of of political truth, in that you can use pure reason to arrive at a system of law that is just. And so you're not looking here at revelation, whether that's revelation from a Roman Catholic perspective, say in the history of the church, or if you're looking at Scripture as revelation, you are not relying on just some kind of historical authority or the historical circumstances of your unique culture. Instead, you are just asking the kind of abstract questions, right? You have these abstract principles. Pure reason dictates people are like this, government should therefore do this, and therefore we take an idea of what law is and what the state is in its universalized, ahistorical sense, and then import that into historically conditioned, unique, particular cultures, and that'll work. That's the assumption of the liberals. Now, Stahl is going to fight against that significantly. One way he does this is he's adamant that reason is not capable of nearly as much as the rationalist liberals think. You know, the Enlightenment has this very heightened view of the strength of human reason. And some of this is because at this point, people are starting to discover certain things about the world, especially in the realm of science, that we hadn't known before. The world seems more understandable. There are a lot of advances in technology. People are thinking pretty highly of themselves at this point in terms of what is human capability. And Stahl was challenging this to say that there is no purely rational system at all. He's skeptical of these claims of pure reason, of objective reason. And he says essentially every system that you have rests on certain presuppositions. Right? It's not like the rationalists are really just far more objective than everybody else. They come at the work that they do with presuppositions that just happen to be different presuppositions than a Christian would approach things. And not all different either. And you know, people talk about this today as a problem with a kind of pure rationalism, is that it has all sorts of assumptions. You know, if you believe that you can understand the world rationally, you assume, for example, that what is in the human mind actually comprehends reality outside of it. There's no way to prove that. You can't prove that the world exists outside of your own head. You can't prove that the way that you are seeing or experiencing the world is real in any way beyond your own mind, because the only way you experience anything is through your mind. So how can you get outside of yourself to know that it corresponds to reality? Rationalism depends on these assumptions about what the human intellect is capable of. You can't prove that the world wasn't created 5 minutes ago. Perhaps all your memories of the world before then were just kind of randomly implanted in your head. You can't prove that other minds exist, right? That maybe nobody else has an internal conscious experience. It's just you, because you can't get in somebody else's head. So how do you know? To be clear, I'm not saying that we should doubt all those things. The point is that, and Stahl doesn't use those examples, but I'm using those examples to give the general point that Stahl is making, that rationalism that is used to defend the liberal political system is not as objective as it purports to be. And so it is not just dependent on mere reason as much as it claims to be. There are plenty of ideals that they're promoting. There are assumptions about humanity, assumptions about liberty, assumptions about morality. All of these things are assumptions that are not proven by reason, but they're just kind of asserted to be the product of pure reason. The second problem with these liberal ideologies is this view of government as a social contract that goes back to the question of a pure state of nature. So if you're not familiar with the history of political thought and the birth of liberalism, there is this assumption or argument that is made that kind of becomes an assumption in some of the thought. That starts with Thomas Hobbes in his book Leviathan. And I have a talk planned on Hobbes. I just haven't done it yet. But Thomas Hobbes sets forth what he calls a state of nature. And he's kind of a theoretical question, right? He asks, like, what are humans, if humans didn't have government, what would they be like? And what he posits is there's this kind of pure state of nature. So a state of humanity without any governing force. And so different liberals treat this in different ways. Oftentimes it's just theoretical, but there are some who actually seem to argue that there was a historical time when this was the case. Right? There are some that would say, well, humanity probably didn't have government initially. Government just kind of arose as a necessity, and here is why it arose as a necessity. So you start with this pure state of nature, and then theorize how does a human work in a pure state of nature, and then what then is the role of the government in response to that. Now, this, at least in Hobbes, the way that this state of nature is understood is a rather chaotic one. He's the one who comes up with that very famous phrase that life is nasty, brutish, and short. So the life, apart from the coercive power of the Leviathan, the state, is one that is chaotic. Life is one that is essentially selfish. So he says that people are essentially, by nature, they're selfish, and by nature, they want for themselves, and that community is not natural to the state of nature. And that's going to be a really key assumption. So that we as humans are inherently, first and foremost, individuals, and we are individuals who want what we want and will take from anybody else regardless of what the consequences are. Now, you could say that, oh, this kind of has some parallels to the Christian doctrine of original sin, but it's not quite the same. It's not quite the same for a number of reasons, but one of those is that a confession of the essential selfishness of humanity, which to some degree I think is just an observable fact, is not grounds for saying that humans are not essentially communal. And that's where Hobbes goes. So that as human beings, we are, from a Christian perspective, we're fallen. We have selfish desires. We're fallen into sin. We have no spiritual good apart from the Spirit. But that doesn't mean that we are not still communal creatures. And we abuse community because of sin. But Hobbes is going to say, essentially, we're not really communal creatures. We are at heart just isolated individuals who are in this kind of constant competition for stuff. And so government then steps in Hobbes' system as the Leviathan, one to basically stop the violence. And he comes up with this notion of right, that there is and he's actually the first one to come up with an idea of rights in political philosophy. But for Hobbes, there is this right to life. People have a right to live. And so government then enforces that and basically stops people from killing each other. That's the beginning of this idea of the state of nature, and you have this in all sorts of figures following. Stahl is pushing against this, and he's saying we can't form a political philosophy based on something that, first of all, we have no evidence even is the case historically. We have no evidence of human beings existing in this supposed state. And so we can't reason from that to what's the purpose of government. And we are just thinking theoretically. If you're not doing it historically, you're just abstracting something that you can't actually, that has nothing concrete to it. So there is no state of nature. There is no use in creating a political philosophy that has its basis in some kind of theoretical thing that has no reality. You don't get to theorize what may have been the case or what may be the case and then work from there. What we should do in a good political philosophy is work with where we are. Who are our people? Where are we at? What is moral? What is right and wrong? We can't just dismiss ourselves from history and think that we have some unfettered access to some kind of abstract understanding of humanity apart from the historically conditioned cultures that we have. And that's what rationalism is trying to do. So he's arguing against the Hobbesian view, but he's also arguing against the kind of Rousseauian view. And Rousseau is the one in the image here. And Rousseau takes this and basically says that and Stahl's going to very clearly interact with some of these kinds of ideas. But Rousseau is basically going to say that the state of nature it wasn't a selfish one. It was actually pure, and it was much better. And everything basically that humans do in terms of creating institutions and government, that's just kind of messed things up, and we've moved farther from our pure state of nature. So state of nature is a good thing, and we need to go back to that. Regardless if you're seeing it as chaotic and crazy or some idyllic state that we need to go back to, it's all just pure speculative theorizing that has no connection to actual on-the-ground reality. So that is not where any good political philosophy starts. Okay. And the major problem with this is for Stahl that persons are not to be viewed in isolation from society. Persons cannot be isolated from society. There is no kind of individual personal nature that somehow is just floating in the air, abstracted from our actual concrete life in relations to one another. Is there an essence of what human nature is, in a Platonic sense? Sure. But that is not to say that the questions of politics, the questions of who are you individually, can be so abstracted. And I think it's very clear that these types aren't working within a framework of like classical Platonic essentialism or something in identifying human nature. All right. Now, to retain some primitive state of nature is impossible. And so he's saying that there is no state of nature, and also we shouldn't try to return to a state of nature. What's he responding to there? There he's responding to the Rousseauian types who are arguing that the state of nature is good, and that we should, and you see this today, kind of try to get rid of social custom to recapture this state. So it's the idea that there is a kind of pure authenticity, a purity that is found in, primitive life and the modern life, the establishment of institutions and standards in all sorts of ways, whether it's in religion or ethics or manners or whatever it might be. Those things are all hindering us from being our authentic selves as we once were in this pure state of nature. Part of the reason why I am very adamant about dress and manners, because these are actually very essential to social cohesion. And to adopt an idea that these things are irrelevant or don't matter is to essentially adopt a liberal, progressive Rousseauian approach to who humanity is, and to approach a kind of antipathy toward inherited customs and institutions. All right. So he's saying we can't do that. It's impossible. Even if such a state did exist, it would be impossible, but there's no reason to think it did. Here he sums up what the problem is in short. So Stahl says, philosophy, both ancient pagan and modern rationalistic, does not see in law what it really is. So here's what law really is. The order of the living and personal God. Since it everywhere leaves him out of consideration, it treats the law just as it does morality, as a command of reason. And that's the essence of it. So Stahl he's a Christian. He is a very committed Lutheran Christian. And he is saying that we need to understand the law and the state as they are, as things that are given by a personal God. And we are never going to be able to approach some kind of pure rationalistic view of morality and law just by the use of pure reason. And I think you see the results of that. Nobody can agree on what's moral, what's rational, what's rationally moral today. People are all over the place. Because pure reason alone, without any historically conditioned guidelines, or without any religious strictures, you can't do it. Like you can't just come up by pure abstract reason with a series of laws and morals. You have to have presuppositions that you begin with, and you have to have a conception of what is society, what is law, what is actually good. And even if you ask, well, what is good for society, right? For example, I just looked as I was scrolling through Twitter today that there was going to be a debate, between a Christian and atheist on, or no, it wasn't it wasn't actually. It wasn't a Christian. It was Ben Shapiro. That's what it was. Ben Shapiro and that cosmic skeptic guy that I don't know why anybody gives attention to, but this was like, is religion good for society? And I look at that title. Obviously, I haven't watched the debate because it didn't happen yet when I'm recording this. But the question is, how can you even debate that? Because you have to have a conception of what the good is. You can't just say, is it good for society? Because what is good? And that's the real problem, right? When you don't have any objective standard to grab onto, when you're just using reason, you could say, well, I think this is good. Well, I think this is good. But what does it mean to be good in the first place? What is the good? What is society for? What is government for? What does it mean for society to flourish? And so those are the kinds of questions that we really need to ask, and that enlightened rationalism really can't address. You cannot address those questions by means of pure reason. Well, Okay, so let's then move from there. So we've got Stahl's critique of rationalist liberalism. We see what the problem is. And we see here what really the solution is, in short, is that we need to understand that law is given by a good and personal God. So we go from there to speaking about some of the categorizations that he makes and things that we need to keep in mind as we are talking about law and social ethics. So Stahl makes a distinction here between personal ethics and social ethics. This distinction can be found in people like Harless. I think he does it very well also. So personal ethics, Stahl says, are dealing with the imago Dei. This is the question of the image of God in man. And as he's within the Lutheran tradition, Lutherans tend to speak of the imago Dei primarily in an ethical sense. So people understand imago Dei within Christian theology in a number of different ways, but usually Lutherans are speaking about the imago Dei as a renewal in the divine image, because we see that throughout the New Testament. There's this renewal in the divine image, and that means in the moral image, in the way that we mirror the character of God in our virtue, in our ethics, in our righteousness, and how we live in the world. So personal ethics are concerned with the imago Dei. These are things that concern a personal character. The social ethics is not concerned with the image of God. The image of God is an individual thing. Instead, it is concerned with the world order. And so social ethics has to have the underlying assumption for Stahl that there actually is an order that has been created in the world. In other words, there's a transcendent basis of order. So order is not just a purely human construct, though, as he's going to very clearly say, law is a human construct in that the application of laws is something that has been given to human authority. So what we see in his system is not going to be just a theonomic approach. He's not going to say, we'll just use Scripture and that's all there is to say about it. Not to say that theonomists only do that, but there's a lot more to his system than merely that. But we have to have some understanding that there is an actual order to the world. There is an order to community, to society, to states, more than just individuals. Then personal ethics are dealing with personal holiness. He uses that language, which is related to the imago Dei. So this is about what's in my own heart, my own transformation, that is an ethical transformation, versus the common life. So this is more of and not even really, he doesn't use the language of holiness to talk about social ethics. It's not about holiness per se, but it is more about what is good or ethical in the sphere of public life, the shared life that we have with other people. Personal ethics, he is going to say, is primarily about virtue. So we are talking about the development of a virtuous character, virtue ethics, which is a kind of classical approach to ethics that Christians have used in many different ways since the beginnings of Christianity. Well, because it's in Scripture. 2 Peter says, make every effort to add virtue to your faith. And so the life that we live in this world is one of striving for virtue, practicing virtue, failing in many ways, and repenting and receiving forgiveness, but continuing to strive nonetheless. And the social ethics, however, is about institutions. It is not about some kind of internal character, but it's that which is external. It is about developing goodness in the institutions of society. And so we can then speak about this in terms of teleology, or the end or the goal. So what is, and Stahl outlines this, what is the telos of personal ethics? A moral life, right? The telos of the field of ethics is that one would apply these to their own character and have a moral life. Okay, so the end is an actual changed life in the individual. What is the telos, or the goal of the law? And that is that there is an established ethical order of common life. So that there is an order that, as we'll talk about, promotes ethical living and promotes virtue, but does not create virtue, because that's not the role of social ethics, to create individual virtue. All right, then I've got a quote here. from Stahl. He says, that is the high position and worth to which the human race is called, that it not simply fulfill God's commandments, but that it also establish and maintain this order as an instrument and vessel of world rule under God's influence. Man thereby assumes the godlike position of ethical steward, of lawgiver, and judge. And so here he's saying that this is part of what man is called to do in having dominion over the earth. God created Adam to have dominion. God gave Adam in the first chapters of Genesis the authority to name the creation of God. God created, and God could have given everything a name, right? But he instead called Adam to take care of the earth. He told Adam, name the animals, have authority over the world that I have given you. So God has chosen to use humanity to establish rule. And so this is what the state is. It is a man serving under God, given a responsibility and a calling to rule and to do so justly in a temporal order that exists under God's eternal order. And so man has this position of ethical steward, lawgiver, and judge. So the Christian, in opposition to, say, the Mennonites or some of the Anabaptist groups, the Christian can indeed, and is called, if you are called to that position, to be a steward, to serve, to be a judge, to establish laws. These are things that God has given to man. These are not things that God has given us. He has not given us a manual of how every state should run. That is under the purview and under the authority that has been delegated to man. So this is why in Scripture we are told, for example, that Romans 13, that the leader is a servant of God. All right. So that's the broader realm of social ethics. Now that's going to be, of course, pretty essential to this whole thing, because that's what we're talking about with laws. Ethics as it depends on society. So then we have to define exactly what law is. And this is important because Stahl does not always he doesn't actually at all really use the term law in the way that, say, classical Lutheran Orthodox dogmatics uses the term law. And he's very specific about how, and that's not because he doesn't know the classical definitions of law or doesn't agree with them, but he's using it in the realm of political theory, right? He's not writing theology as much as theology informs what he's saying here. Okay, so he defines here the law as the political order as it exists in the state. In other words, this is what we usually refer to as the civic law. What he's not talking about here is God's law in the sense of the law that convicts us of our sins and leads us to the gospel, or the law in the sense that it is the guide and standard for the ethical life. And he's not even really using it in the sense of the civic law as it is as a transcendent eternal reality, though he says it's founded on that. What he's talking about here in terms of law is really how humans implement particular standards within their given society. So when he says law, he is not denying God's eternal law by any means, because he talks about this, but he's not defining it as that. He's speaking about law as it is in a culture, in a nation, that is under the purview of that particular nation. He says that this law, when he's talking about law in this way, it is about an external kingdom rather than an internal one. And so law, in a political sense, is not concerned with what's going on internally. That is the realm of ethics, personal ethics. That is the realm of Christian holiness, of sanctification, of virtue. Those are not things that law is concerned with. The political order has nothing whatsoever to say or to contribute to you being a virtuous person. It cannot make you a virtuous person. All it can do is set boundaries so that you don't go beyond them, and it helps society. It gives you a good context for you to be a virtuous person, but it cannot create anything virtuous within you. Stahl is very clear that he believes Christian regeneration is that which changes the heart. The law cannot do that at all. So it's external. It's the external kingdom. This differs from the way that Jesus speaks about the kingdom of God as something that is within you. For Stahl, the kingdom of God is very different from this external kingdom of law. This civic kingdom, this civic law, is for Stahl, founded on the authority of human leadership. It's not founded upon the immediate command of God, or what we call the lex aeterna, the eternal law. And this does not mean that the eternal law is not important, as we'll see in the next point. Human order, what he's talking about is law, because he's identifying law as the human order, particularly. This human order is grounded in divine order. The state gets its authorization from God. So why is it that the state has the authority to do anything at all? Because it has been given by God. Stahl is not going to say that there was some kind of just free contract by individuals in a state of nature that created government, and the authority of government just comes from the people. Now, there is a sense of delegated authority from the people, but ultimately, the authority to rule comes from God, not from human community. And so the authorization of the one in authority comes from God himself, and that human order, that political order, that is law, is required to order itself according to the divine order. So there is no absolute freedom in the state to say, well, since the state is a human construct, that we get to define it however humans want. No, but humans are obligated to mirror the divine order in this human order of law. All right, so that shows that there's a distinct difference in the way that Stahl views freedom than how it is often viewed within the liberal tradition. Because within the liberal tradition, often there is an understanding that the role of the state is not to conform itself to a moral order, but really instead to facilitate a particular culture and state in which human free choice can be exercised maximally without impinging on other humans' free choice. Okay, then we get to the question of law versus morality. So he makes this distinction between the law and morality. So our morality, Stahl says, is God's immediate commands. And so this is directly from God. We're talking about morals. The state does not determine morals. Those are not things that humans can construct. The law is that of human authority. So law is human authority. We're saying here morality is divine authority. Okay, second, morality is a call to the individual, while law is a call to the whole nation. It doesn't mean morality only applies to individuals, but it is about individual choices and individual character. Third, he says that morality includes the development of virtue, it includes Christian sanctification, but the state does not have it does not have a role in Christian sanctification. It does not cause you to develop virtue. Instead, the role of the state is to preserve common existence among the citizens of that particular state. So it protects common life. It puts some boundaries around what humans are to do in order to create a common community for society to flourish and function. And it helps to, this should be a grounding for the individual to grow in virtue. And it should create a kind of environment that inculcates virtue, but the state law itself cannot do that. Now, as he says here that the state relates to institutions versus personal ethics relating to individuals, we have to ask the question of, okay, what are the institutions? What's he talking about here? You could certainly take this and say, well, that means the state has control over every institution. So the state controls what all schools teach, what every university says. You could talk, lots of things are institutions. And you could certainly use this as some kind of, if misunderstood, excuse this for some kind of authoritarianism. That's not what he's talking about at all. So let's talk about what he means by institutions when he's saying that. He's not saying that it has some absolute authority over every institution. Okay, so he cites 4 institutions that are here for the preservation of common life. And he uses that language a lot, of that kind of preservation or flourishing of the common life of a community. First, we just have the human person, which it's kind of odd. You don't really think of a person as institution, but that's the language he uses. So he says there is one of the things that is necessary for common life is the individual. And so here is where he is he is in agreement to some extent with the liberal tradition, I think rightly so, that there is a sense in which, of course, the law is to preserve the individual. But it's not just that. But there is a sense, of course, in which the law does protect people. And this means that there is a protection upon our freedom. We are not coerced into living a virtuous life, as I said before. So there is freedom given to the individual. That freedom for Stahl also includes and has to include the reality of property. And property rights is a significant theme in Stahl. He has a lengthy explanation of property, characteristics of property, what is property, what's the role of the state here, what's not the role of the state. And I think it's very, very helpful and very detailed. But this is going to be in opposition to the Marxist ideas that are gaining popularity at this time, which Stahl deals with. And he essentially says there is no such thing as individual freedom without freedom of property. Those two things go hand in hand. We have to have some kind of freedom of property to have individual freedom at all. And maybe we can get into that if we go further into this. Okay, second point. The stability and integrity of the family, he says, of the second institution, is the ground of our shared common life. So the state has a vested interest in a not just that, but a divine call to preserve the institution of the family, the stability and the integrity of the family. Because Stahl understood, and rightly understood, that if the institution of the family falls apart, society falls apart. It is the most basic shared common life that we have is the family. And so without the family, it's going to have these ripple effects and destroy society as a whole. And Stahl is fantastic on the issue of marriage. I think it's one of the most helpful sections of his work. And he is at his time already seeing the kind of the loosening of the marital bond. He speaks about no-fault divorce. He speaks about the, polygamy, which not that people were fighting for that quite at the time, but he uses those as examples to say there are things about the family, like that the state should not allow an absolute freedom. Right? This is where there's a differing from at least certain strains of liberalism that kind of say basically everything in life is a contract, and you can, as long as you keep that contract, you can break it all you want. You know, if you made a contract to marry somebody, you can break that contract when you feel like it. And there are no strictures around that. That's not Stahl's understanding at all. He sees that once those familial bonds are broken, then society itself falls apart. So the state has a duty to protect the family. The state can't force spouses to treat each other well and love each other, but it can outlaw polygamy, right? It can outlaw, he makes another, again, he says, it can outlaw the father of a family from just not providing for his family. There should be laws in place to make sure that a man is working and providing for his wife and kids and not leave them without that. So those kind of laws are necessary to preserve society. Then we have the third of these, which is the common existence of the race. And so here is the community moving. So we start with the small and then we grow bigger, right? We've got the individual, we've got then the family, and then the common existence of the race. And largely what he's talking about here is local community. He is, as I said, like a lot of the conservatives in Prussia are very much localist. They're talking about, not that they don't have an idea of national character, but the focus is really going to be on the local community and society, which is a very kind of traditionalist way of viewing things. You are living in your community. You want what's best for your community. You want to have a shared life with your neighbors, a shared life that is a life in a place, not just shared life in ideas or something like that, but an actual kind of concrete on-the-ground place. So this common existence of the race, he says, it includes laws that support and help local communities, laws surrounding business practices and estates. So there are, what he argues for would not be a solely free market with no regulations. What he wouldn't argue for is a completely unregulated market. Not that that's the point of what he's talking about here, but per se, and there is talk about that in Stahl. But there's some kinds of regulations that are going to preserve the common life, and we may think about monopolies. should we have any regulations in our nation against, one company buying so many other large ones? Say, Disney, if they weren't doing so terribly right now. Say Disney just kept making money and buying companies and did really well, and all of a sudden every grocery store, every store, like every shopping center, Walmart, Amazon, they were all bought by Disney, right? One major, giant, mega corporation that controls your entire life, and there's nothing you can do about it. Well, okay, that would be bad for society. Okay, so at that point, there have to be some regulations, and that's where the debate comes in. What are the regulations? How much do you regulate? Should you regulate much at all? But the main point here is to say that the state does have a role in making sure that businesses are honest, things like that, but also that businesses are promoting the flourishing of community and the flourishing of life in that common place. Then fourth, we have the preservation of the church. So Stahl is going to see that as an essential aspect of the role of the state. He is not going to say that the state needs to determine doctrine. It's a major problem if you do that. He's not going to say that the state needs to appoint pastors or bishops, nothing like that. But the state does have a role in protecting the church and being sure that the church has the freedom to be the church and the freedom to proclaim the gospel and proclaim the law, and has the resources that it needs to function. The law, he says, does not include ethical behavior as it concerns oneself. So it's not ethical behavior of what I do personally with myself. I can make dumb decisions. I can think all sorts of terrible things. I can use whatever kind of crude language I feel like to myself. None of that has anything to do with the state, right? We shouldn't have laws regulating every aspect of the individual's life. The law is concerned with that which impacts the community. So it's the question of, does your behavior have an impact upon larger communal life? And if it does, doesn't mean it should be illegal, because it depends on what the impact is, But if it's significant enough, the law has to make a determinative decision about what is going to harm that communal life. Now, how exactly is it that the divine order and the human order relate to one another? Now, in its proper sense, law, as he's talking about it here, is really only that which is backed by the divine order. So by that, he means that, again, he says law is a human construct, or it's a human, not created by humans as a whole, because it's given by God, but it's under human authority. But it is only properly law when it is the enforcement of the divine order that precedes it, and the divine order that gives it its validity. What he doesn't mean is, he doesn't mean that the state can only regulate those things that have an explicit moral command in the divine order. But he says they're not, in the most proper sense, he says they're not law. They're not part of the ethical legal order, but they are things that the state can do. So he mentions a few things here. I have a couple examples that he mentions. He says quarantines, right? If the state says, hey, you should quarantine yourselves, there's a crazy sickness going around, that's, for Stahl, that is not part of the broader ethical order. There is no divine command for that, but that is a kind of thing that the state may choose to do. He mentions another one, which is, there's a decree, say, to lock your house, to lock your door, because there's, some dangerous person on the loose in your community. Well, that's not part of the ethical order, but it is something that is relegated to the state. So what Stahl is most concerned about really is law in the proper sense. This is really a principles of law, a philosophy of law. So we're not really talking about those particular things that, maybe a kind of temporary law that is made for the purpose of protecting a community at a certain time. We're talking about the ethical order. Okay, so then Stahl argues that the law it's based on God's world order, but God's world order specifically as it relates to our common social relations. So God's world order in terms of how we relate to others, and not in the sense that, in every sense, it doesn't mean that the law should regulate whether you can insult somebody. Doesn't mean it's good to insult somebody, but the law should not regulate all someone a doo-doo head or you go to jail for 5 years. No, like obviously not. We shouldn't do that. But as it relates to social relations in a significant way, especially in terms of bodily harm. Okay. So, okay, murder is bad. It is hurting your social relations because you're taking someone's life. That's obvious, but there are other things as well. And certainly adultery would fall under this in Stahl's understanding. Then we have law is founded on. He says law is founded on natural institution. So what he's going to say here is that the things that relate to law are things that are natural. They're not just randomly created. So, for example, why do we have laws surrounding property? Well, because possession is something that is natural to us. There are possessions, and people have had possessions since the beginning of time. And so there have to be laws surrounding possession because possession is a natural institution, or you may call it a right, if you want to use that language. Then he mentions law, marriage, right? Marriage is a divine institution too, but the state has certain laws surrounding marriage and how it's to be done, and how you file your marriage certificate and all that kind of stuff. So there's plenty of, even though it's a divine institution, there's plenty of human legal decision that comes into regulating that. Well, that's founded on the reality of procreation. That is natural, that we are to bring forth children into the world. And not only are we to bring forth children, we are to provide a stable and healthy place for those children to flourish. And that is within the family. The legal order, as Stahl describes it, is not based upon subjectivism. This is not a legal order that is purely, well, our culture happens to be this way, so that's the legal order. It is also not based on pure reason. We're not just saying rationally, okay, what are humans? What is good? What is law? Let's apply that everywhere, as the Enlightenment liberals, rationalist liberals are trying to say. Instead, for Stahl, he says that the legal order is really founded upon questions of teleology, of goal. What is it for? What is its purpose? This means that for Stahl, there is actual order in the world and there are purposes in the world, which means that we can look at different institutions. We can look at, say, marriage and say, well, what's the purpose of marriage? We're not looking at marriage and saying, okay, rationally, is it okay for free individuals to make a contract with each other? And does that preserve their freedom? And how should we treat divorce? Well, as long as it preserves the freedom and it's in accord with the contract they made, that's fine. That's not the kind of way that Stahl is looking at things. Instead, he's going to say, what is the purpose of marriage? And we say, okay, well, purpose of marriage is, and he outlines this very clearly, which is twofold. He's going to say that mutual companionship that is created for a personal intimacy between a man and a woman, which is mirroring that Christ and the church relationship, as Paul talks about in Ephesians. So that's the first part of marriage, and the second is procreation and the raising of children, giving children a proper home that is good for them. And those two things, right, that twofold end of marriage now, that should be that which governs laws surrounding marriage. So we start with the end or the goal, and then the law comes after that to help to make sure that institution within society is functioning toward its proper end. Okay, he goes on, again, I've mentioned this before, but just to be clear again, human legal order is not to be identified with the divine order. They are not the same. However, human legal order is accountable to the divine order. And so that means that it should reflect, and it is called to reflect, the divine order. All right, now, how exactly does the law function within society? Well, Stahl says this. He says the law itself cannot realize the ethical end or the telos of any institution. So the law is to, as we just talked about, the law is to preserve that end or help it to work toward that end, but the law itself cannot realize the end of any institution. The state cannot create some kind of virtuous character within yourself, within a group of people, within a marriage, within a child. Those are not things that the state can do, and it's not what the state is called to do. So I have an illustration there of a curb. Now, this is the language that Lutherans usually use to speak about what we call the first use of the law, is the civic use of the law, to say that what the law does is it provides boundaries, right? The curb is there the curb doesn't make you a good driver, but the curb can stop you from driving off the road and smashing into somebody's house. So, right, the curb puts you in the right place where you are more likely to not do something insane with your car, right? So it provides the boundaries, but it does not make you ethical or virtuous. It could not do something to your character. Okay, so the point, as I wrote it, is it does not produce positive ethical development, but it fosters that positive ethical development by creating boundaries through which that ethical development happens. And here are, here are two examples that Stahl himself gives. He has others too, but these are helpful to illustrate the point. The first is marriage. And marriage and family is going to be Stahl's go-to example for everything because he sees this as so central to shared life. He says, the law cannot demand the devotion of a husband and wife to one another. Right? The law cannot make you like each other. You may hate your spouse. It's not good, and you better work through stuff. The law can't change that. The law can't force you to stop arguing with your spouse or nitpicking everything they're doing or anything like that. But it can have boundaries around marriage. It can do things like he mentions some examples here. He mentions polygamy. It can foster the proper environment for a marriage to flourish in that men are not allowed to take many wives because that is not a good environment or a positive environment that can flourish. Or he says that we should not allow no-fault divorce. We should not treat marriage merely as these kind of temporary contracts that can be broken. But again, if you can't divorce somebody, it doesn't mean that you are going to work through your issues, but it may force you to work through your issues. And to be clear, we're talking about no-fault divorce here too. We're not the other questions of infidelity have. That's another question, but we're not getting to that here. The husband's financial neglect of his wife, he mentions. He believes that there is a necessity for the husband and father to provide financially for wife and kids. And if that is not done, there need to be laws that punish that. I guess the equivalent today would be, the necessity of a absent father to provide some kind of financial remuneration or something to his wife and kids with some kind of child support. But then we have the second example here. The law should not demand church attendance. So it can't force you to go to church. This is not consistent with Calvin's Geneva, but so he's not going to say the law should force everyone to go to church on Sunday. So it can't force you to become a Christian. We shouldn't force baptism by law. But it can create the proper environment in which that the church will flourish. So we see this through what he says is you have laws around Sunday work. You have laws surrounding whether shops can be open, stores can be open on a Sunday, or whether sports teams can play on a Sunday. As silly as I think this is, because it seems kind of, incidental, church attendance in the United States would probably be significantly higher if laws had been retained surrounding these kinds of activities on a Sunday. It sounds silly, but there are many families that just stopped attending church because they were taking their kids to sports games. Now, I'm not blaming the state. If they make that decision, that's the fault of the parents. But it would have fostered an environment with boundaries if the state had those kind of laws. So there's an example. All right. Next, the law should protect freedom in not coercing the ethical life, while also not getting rid of all ethical boundaries. And that's really the core of it. So that what the law does, the goal of the law is not to just provide absolute freedom to make any decision you want to make. The role of the law is to put the right boundaries in place that do preserve human freedom so that we're not forced to be virtuous or forced to be be in church and forced to convert. However, we do need ethical boundaries. We do need some kind of boundaries that help to guide us on the path, that help us to use the freedom that we do have, not for licentiousness, but for the ethical life. All right. Now we've got, let me see what I have. Oh, I got 2 slides, so I can finish this. Okay. The natural law. And I'll read the quote and then I'll explain here. He says, following Grotius, the teachers of natural law posited a concept of natural law as a legal order existing prior to and outside of the state in the state of nature, continuing in the state alongside positive law, even as the most consistent among them viewed the matter, Rousseau above all, as an inalienable right of men valid against the state order, so that the latter, when not in agreement with natural law, is null and non-binding. So what is he talking about here? Now, Stahl, throughout this work, critiques natural law over and over again. And when you hear that, you may think, well, why would he be critiquing natural law? That's part of the historic Christian tradition. Stahl is not talking about an Augustinian, Thomistic, natural law theology. That's not what he's talking about. And at one point he even mentions that and says, I'm not talking about this. And then he moves on. But he doesn't get into any detail. So it's clear that that's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about is the theories of natural law that are part of this rationalist Enlightenment liberalism, which contends that natural essentially is something that is discoverable purely by reason, which is generally this idea of a kind of absolute freedom. And he cites Rousseau particularly, so we know directly who he's talking about here. And this is to say that if you can essentially reason through your theoretical non-existent state of nature of what is what you call natural law, then according to these individuals, as he cites here, basically they can say, well, anything that the state says that's not that, we can just kind of ignore it, right? We could just say it's not binding on me because it's against natural law. So you come up with this series of rights which you have determined are natural rights, and you say, well, the state can't impinge on any of my rights that you've predetermined to be part of your essential rational individual self in the state of nature. And now you have said, okay, well, now I can, if the state impinges on those rights that I have predetermined, then I could just ignore it and the state has no authority. And that leads to basically complete human autonomy for us to be able to just simply determine by our own rational exploration of some non-existent theoretical state and go from there to saying that, well, the state has to follow what I say or I'll ignore it. It does lead to autonomy and kind of chaos. All right, then we have revealed law. Okay, so we've got the distinction between this natural law, and again, natural law not in the kind of classical Christian sense. We're talking about the Enlightenment notion of natural law. The revealed law, he says, all law is essentially based on revelation, all of it. So there is no human constructed law by pure reason. And he says that there is, there's a twofold revelation. There's special revelation in Scripture, and there's general revelation. And in terms of general revelation, so generally when people talk about general revelation with the moral law, people tend to speak about this in a twofold way, where we've got the rational, like we can make a rational argument that say, abortion is bad. And you can make a logical argument. You don't have to use Scripture to do that, which certainly you can. And to be clear, Stahl would not be against doing that. But then we also have this notion of law that's written in the conscience. There's kind of an inherent sense of what's right and wrong. Stahl's really going to focus on that latter part of this, the law as it is written on the conscience. Romans 2 is kind of the classic text for this when Paul speaks about the Gentiles having the law written on the heart. And so for Paul, there was this inherent notion of the law of right and wrong. So Stahl is going to emphasize that rather than this other aspect of natural law. Why? Well, because he doesn't want to give the ground to people saying we can, by natural reason, decide whatever we want. Okay, he says this: the commands of Christian revelation, like those of reason and justice, form a binding standard for the establishment of law, a claim on the legislator. They are this, however, in far higher degree and in an entirely different form than the latter, because they enjoy the special sanction of God and because he himself indicated their particulars. Okay, so he's saying that that which is directly in Christian revelation, Scripture here, is the most binding. Right? These are the things that have the highest degree of authority. Then he's going to, there's a lot to say about this last point, but I just have a quote to leave you on, because I want to explore a lot more in his work, but I'm going to leave you here and see if you're interested in more, so let me know. The Christian state. He says this special regard is owed the commandments of the Christian revelation above all, because the Christian revelation is the eternal truth, the actual will of God. See, he starts there. This is why I love Stahl. He doesn't just say, well, it's just the tradition of our culture. It's the best thing that we've got. He's blunt, and he says, no, it's eternally true. It's the actual will of God. And then, though, he goes on to talk about the importance of the inherited culture, which is essential, but he starts with the objective validity of the claims of Christianity. Then he says, furthermore, because it is the public faith of the nations of Europe, Christianity cannot refuse obedience to the commandments and declaration of God in the Old and New Testament, even in its public institutions, without fearfully sinning and contradicting itself. So he's saying that our nations need to be Christian for two reasons, right? So the first one is that because it's true. Christian revelation is the eternal truth. And then second is that is our inheritance. That it has formed our ideas, it has formed our habits, it has formed how we think about things, how we interact with one another. And so we are, even if you reject the objective validity of the claims of Christianity, you are an inheritor of habits and ideas that arise from Christianity. Well, that's the end of what I have on this PowerPoint. There's a lot more to talk about, and I only have some things here. I could go on about Stahl's ideas for a very long time. He had a lot to say, and I think it's very helpful. But let me know if you want me to continue to do this or if you have no interest at all. So I hope you found this helpful. Make sure you subscribe and like this, comment, all those things. It helps. And we'll see you in the next video. God bless.